Today, we continue with the series of interviews with specialists about the crimes committed by the German Wehrmacht during World War II, trying to demystify the myth of the clean hands of the Wehrmacht. Once more, you will have the chance to learn from one of the best. But before we go for it, I'll invite you again to check out the last interview we did with Dr. Harrisville and to follow us on Instagram. The links will be available in the description of the episode. This interview is also available on YouTube. Now, it's time to introduce our guest. Waitman Wade Beorn is an American historian and former U.S. cavalry officer who specializes in Holocaust studies, focusing on the Holocaust in the Eastern Europe. He's currently an assistant professor in history at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne. Beorn previously served as the Louis and Franz Blumkin Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Nebraska Omaha. From 2015 to 2016, he was the executive director of the Virginia Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia. Dr. Bjorn's first book, Marching into Darkness, The Wehrmacht and the Holocaust in Belarus, explored the local participation of the German army in the Holocaust. It looked at a series of case studies of units in the, now I'm going to try my German here, Generalbezirk Weißruthenien during World War II. It argued for a progression of ever increasing complicity by the Wehrmacht in genocide. His second book, The Holocaust in Eastern Europe, at the epicenter of the final solution, is a general survey of the Holocaust in the East. His third book is on the Janowska concentration camp. Between the Wires, the Janowska Camp and the Holocaust in Lviv will be released from Nebraska University Press to 2024. You can talk about that later, Dr. Bjorn, just to let us know if the book is out already or not. Beorn is a founding member of the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, an interdisciplinary group of scholars interested in exploring how a spatial and digital approach can better inform our understanding of the Holocaust. He is a digital humanist who integrates mapping, modeling, and social network analysis into his work. His current project is Visualizing Janowska, creating a digital architectural model of a Nazi concentration camp. Dr. Bjorn, welcome to the World War II Daily Podcast with me, Pietro Deserti, and my partner, Samuel De Corti. Dr. Bjorn, again, it's an honor to have you here. It's very special for us. And this intro, I got it from Wikipedia. I'm going to be 100% honest. So if there's something you would like to add or correct, or if something there it's off, please introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always great to come on and put another bullet into the dead horse that is the clean Wehrmacht myth. So thanks so much. Looking forward to your questions.
All right. So the first question is a classic question that we do for every niche guest we have here. So, where does your interest in World War II and the Holocaust and all of these topics come from? Where did it started?
Yeah, I think the easiest explanation is it came from my family initially. My both my parents um, were the kinds of people that when we went to a museum, we would like relentlessly read every single thing in the museum, every piece of every exhibit. Um, both of them inspired in me a real love of history, and sort of interrogating the past and thinking about the past. And my father in particular was always interested in the Holocaust. He'd been in the army, the American army, in Germany from '69 to '71, um, and he had visited the concentration camps there. Um, and would always anyone who came to visit, he would take them to one of the concentration camps first, just to remind them that Germany's awesome and there's lots of great things that Germany has done, but also that this is part of the history as well. So likewise, the first time I went to Germany as a child, I ended up in Dachau with my parents, um, looking at that. And so I've always been kind of interested. Um, when I got out of the army and decided I was going to go the graduate school route, I looked back on my undergraduate work, which had been on the Holocaust, in this case on Nazi doctors in the Holocaust, and yeah, I decided, I want to explore this a little bit further. Excuse me. So, I'm not exactly a military historian, so my interest isn't sort of directly in the military piece of World War II, though I think it's critical to highlight the fact that the World War II and the Holocaust are not separate events. Um, they are inextricably connected to each other, and so it makes sense actually that we talk about the military and the war and the Holocaust all in the same sort of conversation because these things are deeply connected. And so when I did the first book, I was really looking at issues of perpetration and how do people become perpetrators, um, using the military as an example, um, partially because my advisor, who was Christopher Browning, who was a really, really fantastic advisor and did what fantastic advisors do, which is to sort of figure out what it is that drives their advisees, what makes them interested in a topic, and then help them to find their place, as it were, in academia, in academic subjects. And so, I had done work on the Nazi doctors, but honestly, there's a lot of work done in that area. There's not a lot of new. There's always new ground to be covered in history, but there's less new ground to be covered in that particular area. However, the looking at individual soldiers in the lowest level and what they're doing with regards to the Holocaust was something that hadn't been, and so he kind of suggested that might be an area to think about, that I might be particularly well equipped to talk about based on my experience as someone who's been in the military before. So that's sort of how I came into this particular topic as regards sort of the clean Wehrmacht, and World War II.
Awesome. Samuel, do you wanna go ahead for the next one?
Oh, actually, for the audience, I think they'll be interested to know. We asked Dr. Christopher Browning, who wrote the book Ordinary Men, which is again about a similar topic. And we asked him like if he wanted to be in a podcast. We did not have a reply yet, but hopefully we'll have him here in the future. His book Ordinary Men, I think it's like the cornerstone of like the Holocaust and the involvement of the Wehrmacht. Like I think every study into this topic should have at least this as a basis. Um, it also goes into the next topic, which is the how do I say this? It's a clean Wehrmacht myth, which we discussed with Dr. Harrisfield in the previous episode, where he mentioned that the myth already originated at the end of the Second World War and not at the end of it. Like not after the Second World War, but at the end of the conflict, like the soldiers were viewing already themselves as victims. Um, and they were also using the same justifications that they would use later. That actually makes me a bit curious, Dr. Bjorn, because why are some people Wehrmacht apologists? Like, do you maybe shed some light on why some people, yeah, think this way?
Well, I think, and I don't know how much, the extent to which David talked about, sort of the long origins of this. Um, but there's the Wehrmacht was allowed, Wehrmacht veterans were allowed to create this myth at the end of the war, right? The Nuremberg trials explicitly don't make the Wehrmacht a criminal organization, for example, um, unlike the SS. So we're already right there. There's a distinction because the SS is termed an organization that, by simple membership in it, you are considered to be a criminal, not the Wehrmacht. Then, the Allies, the Americans in particular, import these Wehrmacht generals and ask them to, tell us the story of the World War II, and tell us what it's like to fight the Russians, because obviously at the end of World War II and moving into the 50s and 60s, the Russians become apparent as the enemy now, and so the Americans and Westerners in general are now interested in how do we fight the Russians. The people with the most recent experience doing that are the Nazis. And of course, these guys, von Manstein and Halder, and all these other folks that are invited to sort of help us, von Mellenten, to help us sort of think about how to fight the Russians and to tell your story about what World War II was like. Of course, they leave out all of the stuff about the Holocaust, and in particular, they leave out anything regarding what the military did to further the Nazi genocidal project, which is a lot. And so you get these memoirs after the war. I mean, if you think about it, it's actually kind of insane. Von Manstein writes a book that's incredibly popular called Lost Victories. And you think about it, this is a Nazi writing a book about lost victories, and people are reading it and being like, oh, this is really interesting. Lost victories meaning like the victories that made the Nazis not win the war, as if this is like some kind of bad thing. And I'm getting to your question here, but so you begin to have the basis for a popular understanding based in part on at the beginning based on these sorts of very curated and sterilized depictions of the Wehrmacht as this kind of super professional, tactically excellent military fighting against sort of overwhelming odds against people who are now the bad guys, um, in a sort of desperate situation, which has its own kind of romantic appeal to it in a certain sense. If you're able to divorce all of that from the reality of the Third Reich and the Nazi state, which is what these sort of memoirs set the groundwork for. And then you start to have the popular culture sort of catching up to this. And so movies and comic books and TV shows, even video games, there's a whole sort of popular entertainment complex in which the Wehrmacht is not tarred with the same brush that we tar the rest of the Nazi state. Um, there's a movie called The Cross of Iron, a Sam Peckinpah film, which is very, very famous. And it's really entertaining. And but again, the Wehrmacht is the good guys in this film. You're sort of rooting for them, and this is weird. And then video games do the same thing. So I think, excuse me, I think that some people become sort of clean Wehrmacht aficionados. And it's not that everyone who falls in that category is a Nazi or is a fascist even, or somebody who, necessarily has any of those beliefs. I mean, a lot of those people, I think, fall into that category just out of sheer ignorance because they're fed this sort of line in popular culture that the SS, very bad. SS does concentration camps. SS does the Holocaust. Very, very bad. Wehrmacht has nothing to do with that. They're just out there fighting the war. So it's kind of okay to talk about like how cool the MG42 is and how cool the Tiger tank is and the Stuka dive bomber and all this sort of stuff. Because we can then separate that in some way from the bad things the Nazis do, which is the Holocaust. And obviously that's not true historically. But I do think that there are lots and lots of people who just haven't been exposed to sort of the depths to which the Wehrmacht is a tool of the Nazi genocidal project and is an enabler of that. And of course, you also then do have people who are, on the right wing or the far right, for whom they have an ideological reason to also prefer to see the Wehrmacht as, sort of totally apolitical, excellent fighting force that only lost the war because it was simply outnumbered, not because it did anything wrong or because anybody that was fighting was any better than they were. And this gets to another piece of why defeating this myth was so hard in the intervening years after the war, which is that the SS in the grand scheme of the Third Reich is a relatively small organization with a relatively small membership, whereas the Wehrmacht has around 17 million men and a lot of women, some 500,000 women, who serve in it at some point during the war. So if you call the Wehrmacht, a tool of the genocidal state, a complicit organization in the Holocaust, now you have to deal with the fact that, well, that's actually a lot of people, and that's actually a lot of fathers, uncles, grandfathers, et cetera, and now we have to explain that, and that would then suggest that at least some of those people, you know, were more than just sort of apolitical soldiers, right? And so, if you are in the sort of, you know, far right ideological ecosystem, um, you don't want to have to confront that challenge, because the Wehrmacht is doing the right thing because they're fighting the horrible communists, anyway, and so this is all good, um, and anything you can do to sort of distance that from the most obviously wrong things the Third Reich do, I think is in their interest, and so you have probably people that fall, all along the spectrum, as I said, from people who are ignorant of the detailed history of Wehrmacht complicity in the Holocaust and genocide, to people that don't care, to people that are ideologically motivated to sort of massage the history.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting because um I'm more into like the military aspects of the war. This is how I started my page and everything. And I confess that I was very confused about the actual participation of the Wehrmacht in this. I was listening to a lot of the things that you said, like um, some sort of propaganda supporting the clean hands. So I was confused. I had my own grandfather fighting for Italy, and it was super confusing to me until I met Samuel, and he started debating with me some of the posts that we see on Instagram that are exactly like you described. Like they are talking about the MG42, they're talking about this cool Tiger tank of the Stukas and things like that, and um, or they are posting about these like Michael Whitman or these guys, and they're not mentioning their whole in the Holocaust and the terrible things they did, only like the heroic tale of their participation in the war.
I mean, there's
Um,
a whole series of books. I think they're called like Panzer Aces, and I think one's called Infantry Aces, and they're these like hand battle descriptions, right? I mean, they're interesting, I guess, if you're into that kind of stuff, right? So and so destroyed 80, tanks and fought this desperate. That's all great, whatever, but it's completely divorced, excuse me, from the rest of it, which is like, why are they fighting? Why are they fighting the Russians? What are they doing defending Poland in 1945? I mean, like that's the part where people can sort of, and you get this a lot with the reenacting community. People that reenact German units. I mean, first of all, there's a massive overrepresentation of Waffen SS formations anyway, which is a whole different thing. But they many of them will say, well, look, we're not political. I'm just here to represent the soldiers. And it's like, okay, but the soldiers were political. The war is political.
Let's separate them.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, and what they're doing is in the service of a state that's political. And so, if you're going to go out there and dress up like them, which I discourage, um, then you have to confront. I think you have to confront the rest of it, and be honest about, this is an this is an organization that is a bad organization. Just like, and I'm American, and I would say the same thing about the Confederacy, because we have the same conversations about the Confederacy and this kind of thing as well. The Confederacy also is an organization, or the Confederate Army is also a military organization fighting to preserve and to extend white supremacy. And you can say the exact same thing about the Wehrmacht.
Interesting. Yeah. It's to me it's super
It's,
interesting because I'm Brazilian, and we hear lots of stuff, and when we meet people who are actually like like you, like researchers, or like Samuel, who's a writer who's doing a lot of research. I learned so much from it, like the with facts and history itself. Samuel, do you wanna ask about the not political history thing?
Oh,
You
no, it's answered. It's you cannot separate the German soldier. You cannot say like, okay, I'm only going to focus on the military aspect and not on the political aspect because there was a whole political dimension behind it. What I
I mean,
actually wanted to add is that we see this a lot. Like you mentioned, the Panzer Aces, Infantry Aces. It's the books by Franz Kurowski, and like sometimes we see posts, and sometimes I send them to Pietro, and it's like, yeah, we have another one. It's like, oh look, he fought so heroically, and he fought so bravely, and he rescued these prisoners. Um, and then it's like you ask them like, what's your source? And then they mention this book, and you're like, yeah, it's
yeah,
I would say it's not really history. It's more like Wehrmacht, like fan fiction, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, it's I haven't read those in detail. I mean, I suspect that there's some basis in fact. It's kind of like if you were to read um, Medal of Honor citations or whatever.
Mm.
People. I mean, I'm not saying that the German military can't have behaved bravely. Like, certainly they did. And certainly people did amazing, heroic things, even though they were in the German military. The dilemma comes when you know you're excluding the rest of the story. Um, the fact that the Luftwaffe is using concentration camp labor to build, the rockets and its aircraft, and that the German armaments industry is deeply wrapped up in the same thing, and that the German army is um, murdering mentally and physically handicapped people in the Soviet Union to take over their hospitals and stuff like that. I mean, like, these things all are clear crimes committed by the very people that we're talking about here. And again, the challenge, because one of the things that I think the people who push back against this, the people that really want to believe in the clean Wehrmacht, they say, oh well, look, not every soldier was a Nazi, and you can't say that all soldiers are sort of fanatic, anti-Semites and fascist supporters, and I think that's fair. I mean, I wouldn't say that every soldier was a fanatic anti-Semite or a fanatic supporter of the Nazi. Many of them were, but the point is that the organization as a whole was, um, and they were members in that organization. Many of them were drafted. Many of them didn't volunteer for it, um, but ultimately, in the end, the organization itself is a genocidal weapon of the Nazi state, and it's used to spread genocide, to spread Nazi occupation and all the things that follow along with that to other countries in Europe, and in many cases to carry out genocidal projects and programs itself. Um, so again, yeah, I mean, you can't separate these things.
all right. All right, so you started talking a little bit about it, but would like to listen from you. What are the arguments that these Wehrmacht apologists they use? Because we listen a lot to the victors' right history, or like you said, not all of them were Nazis. We listen to, we read all of that on Instagram, especially. So, would like to know from you what are the common arguments that these apologists are using or that they used.
And I think one of the biggest ones is they sort of say um, that the SS, the one I've already mentioned, that the SS is responsible for the Holocaust. And this springs from a very, I think, simplistic view of what the Holocaust is. If we're talking about the Operation Reinhard camps, where we have hundreds of thousands of Jews being um, pushed into gas chambers, then yes, the SS is absolutely responsible for that. Um, yes, the SS absolutely runs the concentration camp system. Um, they're responsible for that. But over almost 2 million Jews are murdered in the Holocaust by bullets, um, which is carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, but the SS is deeply involved in that as well. They are officially they sign up officially to support the Einsatzgruppen by giving them food, ammunition, transportation, these kind of things. So they're deeply complicit in that. The German army runs the second largest genocide of the Nazi state, which is the killing of Soviet prisoners of war. The German army is almost solely responsible for the murder of 3.3 million Soviet POWs, right? So, and those are just some examples of how it's not just the SS that's carrying out the Holocaust, right? But that's I think that's one of the arguments. Oh, they're not doing that. The other is that one of the others is that, of course, in conjunction with that they're too busy fighting the war. So they're fighting at the front. They're fighting against the Russians, predominantly because it's awkward to have to talk about how they're fighting the Americans often because a lot of these people are American. Um, they're fighting the Russians, and we all know the Russians are bad, right? Because they're communists. We all know communists are bad. And look what the communists did look what the Red Army does when it gets into Germany at the end of the war, and it's raping people, et cetera, et cetera. And so, they're not doing bad things because they're fighting the Russians, and if they're killing POWs, it's okay because they're Russians, right? So like there's this part of it as well. Um, and I think it's also this idea of apolitical, that the military is an apolitical organization, because there's kind of a prohibition against being a party member, especially for like the officer corps. But of course, that doesn't mean that they don't have, um, deep allegiances or agreements with the ideology of the Nazi state. And as the war goes on, the military becomes the German military becomes even more politicized to the extent that they institute political officers, which is exactly the thing they've been so angry that the Russians had been murdering Russian political officers. But by 1943-44, they have their own Nazi political officers there to ensure that German soldiers are actually politically awake and viewing the world through the same ideological lens as the Nazi decision makers. Um, Not to mention that as the war goes on and the different year groups begin entering the Wehrmacht, more and more of these groups of young men has grown up under the Nazi state and under the propaganda organs of the Nazi state, and so you can't really make the argument that the Wehrmacht isn't political or doesn't subscribe to the the beliefs of the Nazi state. So I think those are at least three to start with. This idea that uh, the SS did everything bad, that the Wehrmacht, was busy fighting the war, and that was the good thing because they were just fighting the war, and the war itself had no sort of negative political connotations. And then this idea that they were apolitical.
It, it also leads me to another question, because I've read your book, Marching into Darkness. And in that book, there's a chapter, and I think it's a very disturbing chapter, but it's also very important to talk about it. And it talks about the exploitation of the Jews. How, for instance, some cases, like some people try to extort money from the Jews. So it said like, if you pay this amount, we'll not deport you. Or even more disturbing, some Wehrmacht soldiers would like protect some Jewish women in exchange for sexual favors. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean the army that enters this predominantly the Soviet Union um, is an army that has been given a green light for all kinds of criminality. One of the orders that predates the invasion, so it's issued before Barbarossa, is the so-called jurisdiction order. And the jurisdiction order basically says, look, for crimes that you would be prosecuted for anywhere else in Europe, we're not going to prosecute you for in the Soviet Union because it's really big, and we don't really care, unless with the exception of whatever you've done also has some kind of negative impact on the war effort, right? Um, and so one of the result, and this, so I mean, imagine, right? What is the message that you're sending to an organization when you explicitly say we're not going to prosecute you for things that are criminal? I mean, like you are actively encouraging that kind of behavior. Um, and rape and sexual violence is something that has always accompanied wars and militaries in one sense or another. Um, and in the case of World War II in the German side, you're adding into it an entire racial worldview and racial ideology that means that some people are less human or less worthy of consideration than others. And all of these things create this sort of perfect situation where uh, German soldiers are able to victimize women, not just Jewish women, but Jewish women are particularly vulnerable because they can be murdered, and that you can literally destroy the evidence of your so-called crime um, by killing them, right? And again, some people say, "Oh, well, the Wehrmacht wouldn't have done this because the Nazis have the Nuremberg laws, which are the prohibition against sexual relationships between sort of Germans and racially inferior people." But we know that that's bogus. I mean, like, yeah, that existed, but um, there are SS judges during the war saying that they think that 50% of the SS in the Soviet Union have violated that rule. It doesn't. We know that that doesn't actually stop these relationships, um, whether they be sort of violent rape, whether they be sort of coerced, which is it's a form of rape, but it's more of the sort of coerced that you described, the sort of sexual barter. These kinds of relationships um, were not in any way limited by sort of a fear of so-called race defilement. Um, and so, yeah, the German military men would take advantage of this. The military itself does. It establishes official Wehrmacht brothels throughout throughout Europe, and these are complex because we don't have a lot of information about a lot of them. Certainly, some of the women working in these places did so voluntarily and had maybe been sex workers before, but there's significant evidence that the Germans also rounded up women in various places and forced them to do this, so that essentially you have a a system of institutionalized mass rape that is sponsored by the German military. Um, and again, that is not something that your sort of Veraboo, clean Wehrmacht person really wants to have to engage with. But it's out there. It's true. I mean, these things took place, and there's evidence. Um, we just it's there's less evidence, and it's much harder to find because it's a much more sensitive topic. But it certainly took place, and it was one form of victimization um, of many. It's one that is particularly devastating for Jewish women because, as I said, they could be just straight up murdered afterwards. So a lot of times this takes place in conjunction with those killing operations, where that these people are going to be killed anyway, so you can do what you want with them and then kill them. But certainly, it also was a phenomenon against non-Jewish women as well, a widespread phenomenon throughout Eastern Europe predominantly. In Western Europe, you'd be more likely to be punished for this kind of thing, so it's less likely to happen.
It's crazy because when we talk about it, I was telling my wife about this because when we talk about these topics, it's I think some people they disconnect like the fact that it actually happened. It's not a movie that we watch and we're debating, and it's shocking when you start studying it and you think about it, it actually happened. People were actually able to do that. They actually engage in those kind of things. It's disturbing to me, especially after I had like my first son. It got super disturbing to me. I interviewed a Polish veteran, and he mentions drunk German soldiers rounding people in squares in, I'm not sure if it's in Lodz or Warsaw now, and they're mocking these people, pointing guns at their heads, pushing them, punching them, taking out their clothes and touching them, and it's terrifying. But the next question is, how do you think, like, how do you see it? How the impact of this myths in the world nowadays? Like, how what is the impact of it in our current world?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, and again, I think you see this a lot in the public sphere of people who just think that the German army was kind of like every other army, you know, and that, my fear is, in conjunction with that, is that, we'll get to a point where it'll be like the Napoleonic Wars, where, like, if you want to dress up like a Napoleonic soldier, or you play a war game and you want to be the French, nobody's going to be like, you're a horrible person. I mean, maybe here in England, someone might still think that way, but, like, generally speaking, no one's going to be like, oh my god, like, are you a fascist? Like, what the hell? How could you possibly support the French, right? Or you can be the British, or you could be the Prussians, or what? Like, no one's going to care. And I worry that we'll reach the stage, and it's partially in the gaming world. You can see this too, but I worry that we get to the point where that's sort of the idea. Oh, you can be the Germans, and we can joke haha about the fact they're Nazis, but the army is this separate organization, and it's not really involved in that. And you can see this in video games and board games and things even today, where you can play as the Nazis. And on the one hand, I get it. I'm not a complete killjoy when it comes to that, but I also think it's kind of weird, if you're gonna embody a genocidal, racist, anti-Semitic sort of organization. Um, at the larger level, perhaps, I think, and probably maybe more significantly, if you subscribe to the clean Wehrmacht myth, what you're doing then essentially is saying that the Holocaust and the Nazi genocidal project, so all these things that are, wrapped up in the Nazi violence, are basically committed by a very small group of people, um, and that everybody else was kind of just not involved or doing their own thing, which is its own sort of, in a certain sense, it's its own kind of form of Holocaust denial, because you're basically sidestepping the fact that there are lots and lots of very ordinary, very normal people, who in some way, shape, or form are engaged in something similar, as well as organizations, that are engaged in these kinds of things. Um, I also think that if you reject the the facts of the clean Wehrmacht, of the Wehrmacht as a complicit organization, it makes it difficult for you to look at your own military organizations, um, and see the problems that can, mushroom into what the German army does, right? Because ideology is one thing, but also I think one of the main causes of Wehrmacht criminality and of Wehrmacht complicity in the Holocaust is a dysfunctional institutional climate with dysfunctional leadership, dysfunctional values that encourage certain behaviors that are, transgressive behaviors. And I think there are lots of lessons for that for modern militaries today. I mean, I was in the U.S. Army, and I will certainly say that we are not a genocidal organization, and most of the time we are not in any way a criminal organization, and that the war crimes committed by the U.S. Army tend to be the exception rather than the rule. That being said, we have committed war crimes. We do have dysfunctional cultures sometimes in the military, and a lot of the things that we can use to both identify, analyze, and prevent those kinds of war crimes in the future, we learn by looking at the way the German military functioned, right, and how or didn't function or was dysfunctional. Because we could make the same argument. You could, oh well, the American military never commits any war crimes because they're just an apolitical organization. Well, maybe not, but I think a lot of the things that we can identify as sort of contributing factors to crimes against humanity, violations of international humanitarian law, that the German army in the Holocaust commits, we can see similar things, maybe not as bad, maybe not as widespread, but in modern militaries today around the world. And if we don't recognize that almost every genocide that's ever taken place has taken place in the context of a war, and that in those contexts, militaries are quite often deeply involved, then we're really missing one of the key elements of understanding genocide and therefore of watching out for it and potentially preventing it.
That's a good. Samuel, do you want to do the next one?
Yes. Because one of the counter arguments that we often hear is that there's a lot of focus on the Wehrmacht, and then people say history is written by the victors. But especially in the case of Wehrmacht complicity in the Holocaust, could you actually say that history is written by the survivors? Because in this case, the victims rarely survived, and all that we have left are the statements from the perpetrators.
Yeah, first of all, in a certain sense, yeah, sure. The victors did write a lot of the history after the Second World War. Doesn't make it wrong. And also, by the way, there are lots and lots and lots of fantastic German historians who have, written about the clean Wehrmacht and how it's not clean, and have uncovered these crimes, right? So in that sense, that's kind of a cliche, I think. Obviously after the war, there were lots of Germans who thought that the Nuremberg trials were victor's justice. And whatever you think about that, the facts that came out of those trials are facts. That's just true. So I think that on the one hand, yes, and this is much more of perhaps a scholarly, historiographical, uh, discussion. For a long time, Nazi voices document or dominated scholarship on the Holocaust. Um, not in a biased sense necessarily, but in the fact that a lot of historians focused mainly on documents written by Nazis as evidence, right? Didn't make these historians sympathetic, but it means that they were relying on captured documents, military documents, post-war interrogations, Nazis speaking about Nazis, writing about Nazis, this kind of stuff. And so that does leave out the experiences of other people, who are in these environments, particularly Jews. And yeah, on the one hand, there is a quantifiable element to this. That yes, there are, particularly in terms of the Holocaust by bullets, there are fewer survivors than there are in other sort of arenas of the Holocaust. There are survivors, and there were survivors, and a lot of many scholars in the beginning, excuse me, particularly if you were focusing on the perpetrators, overlooked survivor testimony because it's there, it's out there, and it has been there. Um, And I think now, the standard is to include those stories, to include those perspectives, um, because they're really important. Because one of the things that happens, um, when you rely only on the perpetrators, is that their bias can often seep into your work. And I don't mean this as a denigration of those people's works, but it's just it's a source bias. When you look at the same kinds of sources over and over and again, whatever biases are in there, even though all those people, I'm sure, are not supportive of the Nazis, um, but things can seep into sort of the overall presentation. And I'll give an example. One of the examples of this is that quite often in documents and in even in some testimonies after the war by former perpetrators, by Nazis, they like to paint this picture of killing operations, whether they be in the extermination centers, the camps, or whether they be at these open air shootings, as these kind of very organized affairs, um, where there wasn't a lot of violence other than the actual killing itself. Things went relatively smoothly. The Jews went like lambs to the slaughter, et cetera, et cetera. Almost humane, right? The word that sometimes we even use themselves. Oh, it was a relatively humane process. And of course, we know that that's actually not the case. These were horrendous scenes. People resisted. People tried to run away. People fought. Women were screaming and children were. I mean, these are awful situations. Um, but for a variety of reasons, the perpetrators don't want to admit that. And so their documents, if you just rely on their documents, the view that you get of those events is a curated one. It's a sterilized one because that's what they want you to see for a variety of different reasons, right? Um, so I think um, initially, a lot of work because a lot of work was focused directly on perpetrators, and it was focused on sort of the smoking gun documents. But I think now we've moved away from that pretty significantly uh, to try to include other perspectives that counter some of the sort of perpetrator biased kinds of documents.
All right. Do you want to add something, Samuel? No? Yeah. So, Dr. Bjorn, the next question is like, I think the starting point of all these interviews we're doing, the posts we're doing about the clean hands of the Wehrmacht, uh, is to inform our audience on how to identify the propaganda, right? So these people are scrolling on TikTok and Instagram, and they are watching these videos. Uh, would you like do you have any like questions that these people like our audience or the people on Instagram, the general public, they can make to themselves to identify the myth of the clean hands or like German propaganda on internet, something that would help them to identify it?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the challenges, right, of the sort of new media forms that we have out there. Whether it's a podcast, and I have a podcast as well. Or whether it's a YouTube channel or a TikTok channel. I think, and this is going to sound maybe very old school, but the first thing to do is to go to the sources, um, or ask for the sources. If somebody says that the Wehrmacht was not involved or in something, where'd you get that? Who is that? So if you're, ask you, Google them. If you're looking at a podcast or a TikTok or a YouTube channel and someone says something, well, who is that person? Do they have any expertise in this area? Um, and if not, who are they citing? Are they citing people with expertise in this area? Um, or are they just kind of going off of vibes? And I think that's really the first step, um, because there are certain tells, but they can be relatively specific. One of them is, sometimes there's a lot of sort of whataboutism. So like there's a false narrative that goes around in some of these Holocaust denier / far right communities that Eisenhower uh, was responsible for starving millions of German POWs after the war in these Rhineland camps, right? And that's been massively debunked by all the scholars involved. But if somebody quotes that to me is a red flag. A thing like red flag goes up that you're dwelling on you're delving into some areas that are coming from a place of ideology rather than a place of history. Um, if they're mentioning, if they're overly mentioning sort of Allied bombing, for example, or you know, uh, how awful the Soviets were. And I'm not saying the Soviets were not awful, but a lot of times in stuff that tends to skew, I think, biased / far right in the Wehrmacht realm, it's like look how awful the Soviets are, with the underlying assumption is that they deserve whatever they got, and whatever the Germans were doing was just a response to what the Soviets were doing. And again, let me be clear, I'm not here to excuse the Soviets. The Soviets committed genocide of their own and killed millions of people. I'm not here to do that. I'm just talking about the kind of rhetoric that you see. And a lot of this rhetoric, as I said, is kind of, look how terrible the Soviets were. You'll see ones where it's, you know, um, how many Jews were in the Soviet government, right? I mean, it's again, yeah, the question is also like, what kind of clean Wehrmacht myth are we talking about? Because there are well-meaning people who just are talking about tanks or whatever, and they're not, and I'm not going to necessarily fault them for not taking time out to have a massive discussion about the Holocaust. But that's a different group than the ones that are sort of saying, how woke it is for us to talk about how the crimes of the Wehrmacht, or how disrespectful it is to claim that Wehrmacht veterans were in a criminal organization. Like those, they're two really different sort of tones that your listeners might come across in the sort of public sphere as it deals with these folks. Um, I think quite often, Holocaust denial and Holocaust denial material is not very far away from including Wehrmacht sort of denial stuff as well. Um, Suggesting that you know crimes that we accuse the Wehrmacht of are actually committed by the SS or by local auxiliaries and not the Wehrmacht, or even were committed by the Soviets. These kinds of things. So it's hard. I mean, it's hard to say. And here's a step by step, way of determining whether or not what you're hearing about the Wehrmacht um, is sort of denial stuff. The other place that I might suggest, just thinking about it, there's a whole nother level of Wehrmacht denial, which isn't necessarily so much about directly about the crimes, but it's just a denial that the Wehrmacht really wasn't amazing as an organization. Um, and so if you're listening to something that is just 100% praising how amazing Blitzkrieg is and how amazing German tanks are and everything else, that's also fundamentally wrong historically. And if you're listening to a site or a source that's giving you that kind of stuff, then there's a good chance that they're also buying into uh, some clean Wehrmacht stuff, because what often comes out of those kinds of depictions are depictions of the Wehrmacht as sort of man for man, a a better man for man, the German soldier is a better fighter than the American or the British or the Russian or whatever, and that's it's very close to sort of sliding into this Wehrmacht stuff, because at some point, as the as the sort of the graph of Wehrmacht love and admiration goes up and up and up, you then begin to have to bring up the clean Wehrmacht stuff because you can't love the organization as much as you want to if you're constantly being dragged down by the fact that it was a criminal organization. And so yeah, so there's a lot of this Verbu stuff. I think by definition has to include some level of either just denial of like I'm not going to see any of the negative things, or outright sort of rejection of the criminality of the Wehrmacht, because the Wehrmacht, yeah, the Wehrmacht was in some ways tactically good, but it's only 10% mechanized at its greatest moment. So this idea of it as being this armored juggernaut is not true. They were terrible at logistics. Yes, they were outnumbered, um, and yes, they oftentimes maybe killed more of the enemy than the enemy killed of them. But that doesn't mean that they were good, or that they were sort of exceptional super soldiers. But I think if you see those kinds of things, that's also kind of a warning sign that we might be getting into sort of the propaganda / mythos world rather than the historical world.
Awesome.
So
Uh,
for me to summarize briefly, basically the first thing the audience would have to do is like look for sources, like is it a credible source, and also to identify certain bias in the post, like is this post like overly excited or enthusiastic about this topic.
Yeah, I think so. And again, it's hard to speak in generalities, right? But if it's one of these sort of thread back and forth, you can start to see if people are trying to excuse the Wehrmacht from crimes and that kind of stuff
Mm.
as well. But there is a kind of breathless, like, teenage fanboying of the Wehrmacht that you see in a lot of these things. It's a kind of a warning sign, that at a minimum you're probably imbibing some uncritical assessments of the Wehrmacht.
Oh, it's interesting because many of these things that you tell us, we also recognize because, like, yeah, Pietro and I have been sharing posts, of course, about this topic, and it's like one of the examples was like, look at their cool uniforms. Like, I know they did wrong stuff, but like, look at how cool they are when they are marching and those kind of things. Um, so I think what you say is very recognizable, at least for us, and I hope for the audience as well. Um, that also leads me to the next question. We asked our followers, like, do you have a question for us that we can ask you?
Hmm.
And several questions came in, and one of them we would like to discuss with you. And the question is, are there any instances or examples where German soldiers not just refused to carry out orders of war crimes, but also took actions against the orders or witnesses of war crimes to the point that it resulted in their execution or imprisonment?
Yes, the answer is yes, and it's an important question because while the frequency of that behavior is statistically insignificant, meaning there just weren't very many of those people, the fact that it exists at all shows that there were people in the German army who recognized that what was going on was morally wrong, and took action to stop it. And so, yes, it's correct that we have no evidence of anyone in the Third Reich ever having been shot for refusing to participate in a shooting, for example, right? And I point that out because I think it's a really important stat, and it's a stat it's something that German defense attorneys defending Wehrmacht soldiers, defending other Nazi perpetrators, were trying to find as well. Because if they could find one example of this after the war, then they could say, look, when my guy says he was worried he was going to be shot, well, obviously that's a valid concern because this guy was, right, and they didn't find it either. Um, for the most part, um, you could decline from shooting and face no more repercussions than sort of being made fun of. Um, And so there were numbers of people who sort of do that. Of course, that's not always the most amazing act either, because many of those guys would end up, guarding people or marching people to the killing site. So it's like, okay, you didn't shoot them, but you're still involved in their killing. The question that your listeners ask is a good one though, which is sort of, did anybody who did get killed, for example, and what did they do to sort of sort of get that reaction? Um, there's an example of a lieutenant who basically was telling his soldiers that the war was wrong and that and that they shouldn't participate in these crimes. And his soldiers turned him in, and he was shot for that. So if you're what they wouldn't shoot you for, refusing. They would shoot you if you tried to convince other people. So that because that gets into kind of a sort of situation, and they don't. The German military was very very harsh against that. So anytime that you sort of were seen as not just individually refusing for whatever reason, but trying to encourage other people not to participate is one example. There's another example of a guy named Anton Schmidt. Anton Schmidt was a German soldier in Lithuania, and he ended up befriending some Jews from the Vilnius ghetto, and he would then load them up in a Wehrmacht truck, and drive them over to Belarus and let them out. And he did this multiple times with multiple loads of Jews from the ghetto. Um, and he eventually gets found out because the Nazis discover, in one of the ghettos in Belarus that all these Jews from Vilnius, and they're like, how do these Jews from Vilnius get here? And they discover that it's Anton Schmidt. He is arrested and executed for that as well. The charge is, of course, not. It's so-called Wehrkraftersetzung, which is uh, action sort of detrimental to the war effort, because he's using Wehrmacht equipment, etc. But of course, the fact that he's taking Jewish workers, so-called, away from the Vilnius ghetto is part of it as well. So that's another example. Um, there, there's a guy named Willie Reese. This is a really interesting case too. Also in occupied Soviet Union, he falls in love with a Jewish girl, um, and ultimately, like legitimately, this isn't one of those like you know forced, coerced relationships. He legitimately seems to fall in love with her, and ends up fleeing with her and some other people to the partisans in in the occupied Soviet Union. And it's kind of tragic because he ends up getting arrested by the Soviets and put in a gulag and ends up dying and never makes it back. So he's not killed by the Nazis, but he also is taking action beyond refusing to shoot. There's a guy named Plaga, a Major Plaga, also in Vilnius, who was in charge of a German army motor pool unit that used Jews for slave labor, but he took really good care of them, protected them, saved them from shootings whenever possible. Um, he survived the war and was honored by Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Museum, as a righteous among the nations. So again, another example of a person who took um, real pains, made efforts beyond just refusing. And then lastly, there's a whole sort of group of people that um, could fall into the category of the kinds of people that your listeners are talking about, and those are deserters. And the deserters, it's a really complex group because some of them did it because they were potentially cowards. Some of them did it for other reasons, but some of them left the German military, deserted the German military because they had legitimate moral disagreement with the war and with the crimes of the Wehrmacht, these kinds of things. And so, beyond just refusing to participate in sort of discrete moments of criminality, they said, "I'm not going to be a part of the organization at all." And large numbers of them are killed um, if they're captured. They are either executed outright, they are put into so-called punishment battalions who have to like clear minefields by hand and things like this. And so lots of them died. And the German military, murders, well, kills around 30,000 of its own people. through its sort of criminal prosecutions for various different kinds of things. And so, the deserters are a group that for a very long time weren't recognized. Even after the war, if they survived, they sort of had to live with a negative military record because they deserted the Nazi army. And that's another group that you may not think of off the top of your head as a sort of group of people who did more than just refuse to shoot, but I think they deserve some recognition there as well.
All right. It's interesting. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, because indeed, I thought it was really interesting that, for instance, like I believe it's Lieutenant Sibila. He's in command of one of the companies, and they receive orders to clear out the village. And he just refuses to. He tells his commanders, like, no, I'm not going to do this. And in your book, it mentions that he did not receive any punishment for it other than maybe they made some jokes about him. And I think this is really important because, like, some of these people tell us, like, yeah, but they had to shoot because otherwise they would be killed in return. But that's not true.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really crucial thing, too. And that's kind of like a second order. If you're dealing with somebody and you say, well, they did this, then always the next response is, well, if they did do it, they did it because they were going to be killed. And of course, we know that's not the case. It's just fundamentally not the case. And yeah, it's not. It's just historically not true. The worst that often happened is that you would be made fun of, called a pussy or something. But when it comes to murdering people or being called a pussy, that's seems sort of fair. But that's a really good point that you bring up, because it's another form of the clean Wehrmacht stuff. Is, well, they didn't do anything wrong, and if they did do something wrong, it's because they were forced to do it because they would be executed, and of course they wouldn't have.
It also, what you says made me think, because there's I believe it's Sergeant Zimber, and he's actually a fanatic, and he actually hopes to carry this out. Like he carries out an execution, or he organizes it. And what he does is, or at least I got the perception that he actually did it also to hope to get a promotion or to appease his superior officers.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so in this case that Sam was talking about, basically it's in the book. There are three companies, all in the same general vicinity. They all receive the order to murder the Jews in their local area. The commander of one of the companies says, "Yep, got it. I'll do it. No problem." He does it. The commander of a second company sort of says, "I don't really want to do it," but goes back and forth, and eventually he does do it. And then the third commander, Sabil, says, "I'm not going to do it," and it doesn't. And the guy that Sam was talking about, the Zimber, is the first sergeant, the highest ranking NCO, non-commissioned officer of um, the middle company, the one that doesn't eventually do it. And beyond probably being, at least ideologically okay with it, he thought that, like, professionally this is what he should be doing. It's like his job, and he wanted to do his job really well. Um, and he'd always wanted to be a first sergeant, and sort of took that to heart. And so, like, again, there are lots of different motivations. It's important to point that out as well. That when we say that the German military was complicit in the Holocaust, and it was, um, one of the reasons is there were people who were fanatics, or there were people who were anti-Semites or racists. But there are lots of other factors as well that contribute to it. And so, you don't have to prove that everybody was an anti-Semite, because there are plenty of people who weren't anti-Semites who, participated in these killings because they thought they had to, because it was what the right thing to do as a soldier, because of peer pressure, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless of, there's no explanation that makes it acceptable, right?
It's interesting. I was here thinking, I mentioned my grandfather earlier, and when he was sent to Greece in 44, they were subjected to a lot of crazy, terrible things over there. And he just deserted. He walked his way back to Italy, and he was a communist. His father was a communist before him, also a World War One veteran, an Alpine veteran. uh, The Alpine had here, my great grandfather. Um, but he joined the communists and fought to the end of the war in the resistance. But anyways, Dr. Bjorn, I want to we need to wrap it up. I'm going to finish the episode, but before, I want to invite you to talk about where people can find your books, and if you want to talk about your podcast, invite our audience to listen to it, and also your YouTube channel that I've been watching throughout the whole week, and it's very nice. I really enjoy your lectures. I've been watching the digital recreation of Janowska. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. Concentration camp. It's a brilliant idea, so people can just walk around the concentration camp. Get to know it virtually, digitally. So it's a really good idea. So do your final considerations and invite people to listen to your own content. That, by the way, I'm gonna put the links for the YouTube channel and for the podcast on the description of the episode.
Great. No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, you pretty much covered it. I mean, my books are available, um, on Amazon or from the publisher. My latest book, if you go on Twitter and find me there, I'm at Waitman B on Twitter. Um, there's a discount code for it. There's also a discount code for it, excuse me, on my website. So you can get 40% off of the my most recent book. But I do also, if you're interested in the Holocaust, please do check out my podcast. It's called the Holocaust History Podcast. Um, it's Holocaust Pod on Twitter. It's available on iTunes, Spotify, any place that you get your podcasts. And I think it's really designed for you know the regular people. It's not a sort of nerdy academic thing. We cover all kinds of different topics. The format is absolutely not me talking. It's me getting on people that are really smart to talk about very specific topics. So, um, last week we had a guy talking about the role of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust. The week before, somebody talking about Dr. Mengele. But it's just a conversation between me and my guest for about an hour or so, um, where they tell us, about a particular topic. We have a reading list that you can follow along with for the recommendations that the authors have given. So yeah, really do check that out, because I think it's really good. It's interesting. Um, you can listen to it in parts and that kind of stuff. Um, Otherwise, yeah, no, that's it. I'm really happy to come on, and I appreciate Pietro and Samuel for having me. It's great to talk about this. And like I said, just um, when it comes to people talking about the Wehrmacht, the more glowing and sort of fanboying they are, the more you want to start to wonder, what's going on here, and be a little bit more wary of the content that you're getting, um, because it's not it's okay. I mean, it's okay to say that when they were doing well, and point out, the military, the German military was successful in this thing and other thing, but always remember that you know I wrote a book about the Holocaust in Lviv in Ukraine, and 100 almost all of a city, a Jewish population of 160,000 people, was murdered by the Nazis. But first and foremost, the reason that they were murdered by the Nazis is that the Wehrmacht conquered Ukraine and got there. If the Wehrmacht had not fought its way to Lviv and past it, these people never would have been under the control of the Nazis in the first place. And so the Wehrmacht is complicit. It's not a good organization.
It's interesting, not interesting, but it's just fun fact. Mengele's bones, his body is a couple of like a kilometer away from me right now.
Oh wow.
Because yeah, because I'm in Brazil right in São Paulo, and this is where he escaped after Argentina or Paraguay, and he died 100 kilometers away from me in Bertioga, and nobody knew that he was that guy was Mengele, and he was buried here in a neighborhood where my wife works twice a week in a cemetery. And then I think in 1985 they discovered that the body was here. They tested and it was him. And now the body serves the medicine school at the University of São Paulo, which is like kind of next to my house, like it's close to my
Oh wow.
house.
Yeah, well, then definitely check out the latest episode because I had an episode with David Marwell, who was an historian, but he also worked for the Office of Special Investigations, who helped to track down Mengele. And he was part of that team
Cool.
that came to Brazil to try to identify whether that was Mengele. So check it out; you'll probably enjoy it.
Yeah, I'll definitely watch it. Samuel, do you want to give your final words, your final considerations?
So I've read the book written by Dr. Bjorn. It's called Marching into Darkness, and I think it is a very disturbing book, but it's also a very important topic to talk about. And I want to thank you for writing it. And I thought it was very informative while reading it. I learned a lot from it, and I hope our audience will also learn a lot from it.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Right. Again, Dr. Bjorn, thank you very much for dedicating your time to us. If there's anything we can do to help you to put your content out there, I'm gonna ask Samuel to put to send me the Twitter link because in my country Twitter is banned. Um, yeah, we joined the crazy uh, select group of countries who banned Twitter. But yeah, so if there's anything we can do to help you spread more than you already have, please let us know. Uh, Thank you again. I'm honored to have you here. I think our audience and me and Samuel, we benefited a lot from it. We learned so much from it because before the show, we've been debating all the things we were going to ask and do, and this leads to this researches and everything. Listening to you was brilliant. Just like Dr. Harrisville, you guys you're good teachers. You speak so well. You do it in a very easy way. I'm a teacher myself, so I'm listening to it and I'm getting also tips of like how to teach people about these, not only these topics, but things in general as a teacher. Uh, Now, I want to say that to my to you that is listening to it and got to this point, you got this far, please be sure you follow us on Instagram. Check out Dr. Bjorn's Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and his podcast that I'm definitely listening to the episode about Mengele and many others. Um, we don't really know, Samuel, what's going to happen for the next episode, right? Because we are waiting the answer of Dr. Browning. But I have an episode written about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the myth of the three brave soldiers. Uh, that Sabaton, the Swedish heavy metal band, wrote a song about it. So maybe I'm going to record it, and then we're going to have the interview with Dr. Browning. We're going to debate it. I'm going to debate it with Samuel. Uh, and that's it. That's the end of episode number 7, part 2 with Dr. Bjorn. Again, thank you very much, and I'll see you all. If you're confused, if you're watching videos following this page or that page and you don't know how to identify if it's propaganda or if it has something to do with the clean hands myth, please send us a DM on Instagram or comment on the episodes on Spotify, Deezer, YouTube, wherever you're watching this. Please let us know. We are here to help you and support you to find the truth and to understand what this myth is and what are the consequences of it, right? Again, people, thank you very much. I appreciate all of your support. You've been listening to the whole episode. I'm pretty sure that you learned a lot from it. And that's it. Thank you very much. Samuel, do you want to say something?
I hope everyone I hope everyone has a nice day.
Me too. See you, people. Thank you very much.